we're going to go ahead and get started with our special session. So if you guys can hold your conversations till later. And so for those of you who are online, who are joining us, thank you for being with us. I think you're going to learn some things. We're trying to advance this conversation, this dialogue between understanding what IPM's role is and the issues of pollinator health. I'm going to keep this brief because we've got three experts on this topic with us today. Unfortunately, one of those individuals could not be here, Mary Purcell, so we're going to have a little bit more time for our three panelists to talk. But the way this is going to go is we will start with Jeff Pettis with ARS. We'll give his presentation. We'll then go to Jen Sass with the NRDC, and she'll give her presentation. We'll then end with Tom Moriarty from the EPA. And then after that, we'll go for about an hour, and then we'll have about a half an hour of panel discussion, primarily from you folks in the room. So we will be monitoring questions online, but unfortunately with our time constraints and just the way things are going, we probably won't be able to address every single question online. But the final thing I'd like to say is this is a beginning point, at least for the center, in helping to facilitate this kind of discussion, and we really look forward to seeing this continue as we work through this issue. So without any more from me, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, and you can go ahead and tell us about yourself and then give your presentation.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm from the Agricultural Research Service, but today, because Mary Purcell couldn't be here, I'm also going to slightly represent NEPA and her concern here about NEPA, National Institute of Food and Ag. But I'll say a few things about relative to pollinators that Mary might have said. Certainly won't cover it as well as I did. But I'm a research scientist in Beltsville, Maryland, just down the road. I deal primarily with honeybees. And most of my comments today will be about honeybees. So what I'd like to emphasize is that the things that I'm talking about in honeybee health, or kind of around honeybee health, they also would help native pollinators, other managed bees as well. So there's a lot of commonalities between some of the stressors that we think are going on in honeybee health in particular. I'm going to sort of move around the slides from the top slides, but that's just usually to give you some idea of what I'm talking about. And I also will give a caveat. We were asked to each use one slide. I was the only one who could listen and follow directions.
You're a winner.
I'm the winner. I have one slide. I think EPA has 2 to 3 slides. As scientists, we love to show graphs and things and declining populations, etc. But most of you, if you follow this, know that honeybee health threat, like we lose about a third of our managed honeybee colonies every year. And that's just in the fall and winter. We're now starting to do a more extensive survey of what we call the summer losses. And those summer losses, when they're added to the fall losses, count close to 50%. So honeybee keepers are facing a constant turnover. They're constantly replacing colonies throughout the year. Before I go any further, I mentioned that I would say something about NEPA funding efforts. NEPA funded 2 large CAP grants, coordinated agricultural grants. The first was research-based, based on the University of Georgia. And they looked for drivers of what we call disease decline. There's all kinds of drivers. Varroa mites, essentially on an adult honeybee in the middle. Various pests and diseases. More recent funding, that first CAP was $5 million over 5 years. The most recent one is another $5 million over 5-year grant. And it's almost exclusively extension effort. So we're doing a lot of survey work on that. They're doing a lot of extension effort, a lot of surveys, and trying to gather information, and then get that information back out to the beekeepers in a timely fashion. So there's a lot of extension effort going on with the second grant. And then lastly, in the NEPA constantly is putting out requests for proposals. And in doing that, they're addressing a whole suite of things such as, pollinator decline, competition between pollinators, et cetera. So NIPA continues to fund quite a bit of pollinator research. And that's about all I'll say for Mary, and I apologize, Mary, for maybe not covering your area completely. You also know that about a third of our diet comes from pollinated crops. It's not the third of the diet that's important. It's the fact that most of the other things are wind pollinated, and then the grains are the staples, rice, corn, and wheat, which we can survive on, but we actually thrive on all those fruits, nuts, and vegetables. So it really is an important issue. Pollinator decline, and especially for me, managing pollinators in agricultural production. If you follow the literature at all, again, the next thing that comes up is, aren't all our bees dying because of pesticide exposure, which the second slide over here is supposed to predict or show. And I show this because this is some housekeeping things that the beekeepers do. We try to kill parasitic mites with those strips. It's a slow-release pyrethroid insecticide on that strip. So beekeepers know that we're part of the problem. We're putting things in our hives that are causing adverse effects. But there's a lot of attention to what is agricultural production system putting into the hives as well. And that comes through the front door of these hives in the way of pollen and nectar. So there is a lot of exposure that goes on. The real question is, how much of that exposure is what is the exposure and what's causing all this harm? So there's a great deal of attention right now on the role of pesticides in pollinator health, and we'll hear from EPA and others about that. But I did want to point out that as beekeepers, we use products within the hive that contaminate wax and stuff. So we're well aware, and we need to do better in our own integrated pest management, trying to reduce that pesticide use, find alternatives. There are resistant stocks of bees and stuff that we should use. So it's an ongoing education for us as well. We never, 20 years ago, we never how we do to control rural mites. I'll also say while I'm on the topic that you'll hear a lot about neonics. And rightly so, one major reason to me, and that is it represents a new route of exposure. So in the past, most of our exposure to bees or pollinators was from foliar or drift, things like that. Neonics, are systemic, and as such, they can be expressed in pollinators. But it's a new route of exposure, so it is a concern. I think, however, if we focus on neonics, our surveys in Europe and the U.S., we've done wide surveys in pollen. The surveys are showing up higher levels of things like pyrethroids and fungicides in particular. We can't just focus on neonics. We need to focus on the whole suite of what are bees being exposed to and what are these things doing to our hives. So that's all I say about pesticides. Coming now down to the bottom, the second picture down here on your right, monoculture and Roundup ready crops. I actually do think our agricultural production systems have gotten really, really efficient, but they've come at a cost. Larger and larger fields, which are really nice for some crops, because the economy of scale, producing crops on such large acres and stuff, is really efficient. But for a honeybee or for any native bee, you have nothing but soybeans out your front door. It's only going to bloom one time of the year. There are no weeds because of the Roundup ready nature of those crops, And so it's really a desert except for that one time of the year that the soybeans are going to bloom. So there's a number of USDA-driven efforts to add diversity back into the land. I'll say something about them in just a minute. But I will say that there's a trade-off here. Increasing agricultural production and clean harvest versus having more diversity. In the past, before Roundup ready crops, you had a lot of weeds and things in the margins, and you don't see that anymore. You don't see much of that. So I think just adding diversity in general in the agricultural landscape will help in that regard. And now I'm going to move over here to this last block and talk about some of the positive things I think are going on that tie into a little bit of all of that. And that is that there's a number of efforts out there to diversify the agricultural landscape. Everything from increasing CRP land, Conservation Reserve Program land, to looking at better seed mixes in those CRP lands, things like that. So there's a lot of effort there. As you're probably aware, in the Midwest, honeybees in particular go into about 5 states. There's about 60 to 70% of the U.S. honeybees in those 6 to 7 states in the Midwest, 5, 6, 7 states in the Midwest. And those are the bees that pollinate around the country. So what happens in the Midwest is what kind of drives the beekeeping industry. And that's where we've seen an expansion of really corn and soybean growing. And that's all driven by economics. All market economics with corn and soybeans. Corn ethanol didn't help. A lot of CRP land, about a third of CRP land got turned over into farmland. But you can't blame the farmer. The farmer was looking at his or her bottom. Corn and soybean prices were really high. So from USDA's perspective, we're now trying to look at ways to increase CRP usage. If we're going to do CRP programs, things like that, then what are some best mixes that we can put on the ground that can make it work? There's a lot of different incentives. I think we just announced a $5 million, $5 million? $4 million, thank you, Rob. $4 million program, and it was targeted at those Midwest states, North Dakota, South Dakota, in those prairie states where most of the bees reside. So there are a lot of positive things going on relative to bee health, in particular some USDA-driven initiatives. But it can't all be driven by policy change or by that. I think the consumer has a big role to play here. And the consumer being that person who demands either food or just adequate food. So I think consumer buying practices. I'm going to wrap up what I have to say. I'm going to go back up here to the honeybee and talk about, I talk often about what's happening in honeybee health as being tied up into 3 Ps. And the first one has 3 Ps in it. Pests, parasites, and pathogens. So there's pests like small hive beetle and white moth, parasites like varroa mite, pathogens that are always in honeybee colonies. They're always present. I mean, we can try to control them, but they're always there. And the way they're causing damage recently, the recent increase that we've seen in bee health, I think, is driven by poor nutrition and perhaps pesticide exposure. So the 3 Ps are pathogens, the poor nutrition, and the pesticide exposure. The bees always have these pathogens. It's only when they're under stress that we think that the pathogens are problematic. The bees can fight them off, just like you could fight off a bacterial infection or a fungal infection if you're in really good health. You're always being challenged. It's when we're under stress that I think these things come out. As far as the remedies for that, I came up with a new, instead of 3 Ps, I came up with 4 Ps. We need to do better prevention. We need to prevent things like that are happening in the pests and problems in beehives. We need to prevent that. In the agricultural systems, we need to be proactive in preventing pest outbreaks and things like that. We need to plant more diversity. We need to get out there and plant. Planting alone is not going to solve everything, but planting diverse landscapes will help. The third P is prophylactic. We've gotten very lazy in agriculture, and this is maybe more of a personal statement, but we've gotten very lazy in agriculture. We're doing a lot of prophylactic treatment, and I know, speaking to the IPM Center, we need to go back to a more integrated pest management approach. We're doing a lot of prophylactic treatment to ensure crop yield, and I think we need to re-examine that. I think it's been driven, we've been highly productive in agriculture, but the prophylactic treatments, I think, are causing some of the harm. And the last thing I'll close with is the consumer part in needing perfection. So we're desiring perfection in our food supply system, and I think that's a fallacy. I mean, I think we just, we don't need perfect everything. So anyway, I'm looking forward to the question and answer, and I think the dialogue here will be good. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Jeff. So we're going to, we got a quick question. Well, we got time for one question. We'll do one question, Bill.
I hear that for rural life that Russian bees are more resistant. Is that true?
The Russian bees are more resistant to varroa mite. So the varroa mite that was pictured in the middle there, it's an invasive species that came from an Asian honeybee. It's been in the U.S. about 20 years. The selection for Russian bees was successful. They're not completely resistant, but they certainly keep mite levels lower, and they require less treatment, or in some cases maybe no treatment. There's other lines of bees that are being also selected for varroa tolerance or resistance. And yes, that's one of the things that beekeepers can adopt. The problem with adoption by beekeepers is they're a very independent breed, and they've been used to this bee or that bee, and they're reluctant to try a new stock. So, but Russian bees certainly are part of the answer.
Great, yeah. Okay, well, just real quick, I'm just curious, since you talked about diversity here, if anybody's ever compared, say, Iowa, Midwest, where you got 640 acre sections of corn and soybeans versus the Northeast, where you've got a lot more waterways and varying areas of plants outside of the crops, in terms of die-off, if there's any difference?
We've tried to look for regional patterns in where the die-offs were occurring. Part of the problem is the bees, some bees move 3 times a year, some bees move 6 times a year. So trying to trace exactly where they were, what we have done is gone to the Dakotas and put them in more diverse settings with CRP and things like that, and more heavy agriculture. And we can see a difference in survivorship going into almonds. So we know that if you have more diversity in the landscape, whatever plant diversity, you're going to get a better bee that will survive better into the winter.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. So now we're going to hear from Jen Sass. So, Jen, I think we've got some your
I think it would be easier not to do the slides because I'm going to jump around a little. So, sure.
Yeah, we'll leave that up for the online.
Okay.
Yep.
Yep. So I'll just introduce myself to the online people. Jennifer Sass, I'm a scientist with NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council. I have been there since January 01, so about 14 years, and I've been working on pesticides that whole time, but it's not all that I work on. I probably spend about 30% of my time on pesticides, probably about 30% on industrial chemicals generally, and about 30% on other health issues. I work in the health program. Most of the work I've been doing on pesticides has had to do with human health issues. And what I'm going to talk about today is the bee issue, but focused on the neonicotinoid pesticides. And what I'd like to transmit to you is a lot of where NRDC is thinking and where the NGOs are thinking. And then what I'd like to ask at the end is to sort of have a conversation or a dialogue and plan maybe a next step about how we impose an IPM framework into the thinking about tackling this problem, how we develop an IPM dialogue, and how we look at IPM solutions to this issue, because I think it's complicated. So, first of all, the neonicotinoid pesticides have been on the markets for a while, since the mid-1990s, so they're not new, but they are the fastest growing and most heavily used class of insecticides in the U.S. They are marketed as reduced risk replacements for the organophosphates and some of the carbamates, as you know. And from a human health perspective, I think it's clear that they are. And the promise with them initially was also that they wouldn't, because they were systemic and taken up into the plant, they wouldn't run off into the field, they wouldn't get into the water. They certainly would be safer for farm workers. And that's without a doubt. We knew that they were acutely toxic to bees. The ones they replaced were also acutely toxic to bees. And it was originally promised that they wouldn't get into the pollen or nectar. But we know now that they do get into the plant. They do get into the pollen and nectar. And I will talk a bit about food and water. There's different ways of applying them, and I think there's a conversation here in terms of what are the different risks and benefits associated with the different application methods. So it's worth going over them a little. The treated or coated seeds is one way. Those can lead to excessive exposures to bees during the application process. But more concerning is that the coated seeds definitely, the pesticide coating gets into the plant and into the pollen and nectar, and we know that. And that would be the long-term problems. They also get into, we know that they get into plants on the side of the field. So, for instance, they've been found in dandelions and other things on the side of the field. Again, areas where bees are going to be foraging. And there's data on that. Another area that's being focused on is the ornamentals, the ornamental landscaping plants. In those, there's a lot of injection as an application route, and we know that the levels that are being injected in some are very high. That's because the ornamental has to stay beautiful for years. It has to be protected from pests. When I've talked to ornamental folks about this, they say, that by definition, these plants have to look perfect. They need to be completely pest-free and look very perfect. So we know for sure that those plants have a lot in the pollen and nectar and the flower, the bloom. We know that. There's data on that. The toxicity tests that are being done on these bees are primarily, there's some labs that are doing a lot of honeybee studies, as Dr. Pettis pointed out, and some that are looking at a lot of bumblebee studies. There's different labs can be focusing on different ones. It is important when we talk about them, it's to be clear about which ones you're talking about. It's not clear how we can translate those results to other species, in particular native species, but for sure the environmental groups are very concerned about the native species. So whereas Dr. Pettis' group research and discussion focused on the commercial bees, we know that the native bees, wild species, are not being managed, they're not being treated, and the solutions to the harms of those bees won't be in treatments. Because nobody's treating them, nobody's helping them out. So those are an important thing that the environmental groups are concerned about. We don't have data on the ups or down numbers of the native bees, so we can't say what's happening to them. We can only presume that what we're seeing in other bee species is happening to them as well. In June of 2014, earlier this year, there was the Task Force on Systemic Pesticides. This was a global task force of experts. They reviewed over 800 papers that have been published in the past 5 years, including both independent-sponsored and industry-sponsored studies. And they concluded that neonicotinoids were part of the problem, that they are contaminating land and soil and water, things that we didn't think would happen when they were first introduced. And they're leading to toxic threats beyond bees, although they have bee statements, but they also raise concerns about earthworms, snails, butterflies, birds, and bees. So there is an ecosystem concern in the global north that has been raised by this, which I think, again, goes beyond managed bees. So when we think about solutions, we need to think beyond commercial or managed bees. There are some human risks that are in a lot of the mammalian toxicity studies. I've been reviewing those in the last couple of weeks. There are some laboratory tests or in vitro studies. Now, it's not surprising. Neonics do share a similar but not the same mechanism of toxicity with the OPs and carbamates that they replace. They do interfere with cholinesterase, or acetylcholine. There are a number of animal studies, a number as in probably 24, in rodents, mammalian studies that are reporting neurobehavioral impairments. The concern with some of these is that they're second generation, so they're looking at, for example, treating the dam or the pregnant mother and looking at effects on pups. Bayer's DNT study, the developmental neurotox study, also showed findings. Again, not surprising, it's the mechanism of action, but it is something to be concerned about. The argument that they're far less toxic than the OPs, I think, is a reasonable one. I think that's true on an acute basis. We have data on that, but in terms of long-term or developmental or chronic risks, the fact that the neonics are more persistent is a real issue and something to think about. I also reviewed all the FICR 6A2 data on imidacloprid, about 10 years of data looking at poisonings. These are the poisonings that are required to be reported by the registrant. There are a lot of poisonings. Did I write down the number here? It's about 20,000. But the thing is that a lot of these are from the flea and tick applications. Some of them, for sure, are misapplications, but they're misapplications that happen a lot. These are people who put it on, I think they rub it on with their hands. These are pets who have been treated and sleep with the kids at night or watch TV and throw up at the kids during the day. There are lawn treatments where the kids are on the lawns, or treatments where the pets are on the lawns and on the treated lawns and then come in and sleep or spend time with the kids. Although they're a misapplication according to the label, it's what happens in thousands of cases. I mean, tens of thousands that get reported to 6A2. So I think those are concerns, but more importantly, they provide some evidence of the human toxicity potential for these chemicals at more acute exposures. And so I think those chronic low-level exposures are important. With the organophosphates, we didn't understand those chronic low-level exposures for a long time, and now we do. There's half a dozen studies on farm workers and urban uses that have shown evidence of low IQ. It seems to be permanent, and learning disabilities in kids who are exposed in utero. So we can wait for that data on these, but I think that there's data here from animal studies and poisonings and other things that should be taken seriously. Food and waterway data, the USGS has done a couple of reports, and also USDA has found it in some fruits and vegetables. So for sure, the fact that it's systemic in nature is a concern. It means that people are getting exposed at some level. There isn't an MCL. There's no drinking water limit for the neonics. And the White House Task Force, of course, has made pollinators a focus, and pesticides are part of that. There's been some local bans around the country on neonics. Oregon's Department of Ag banned dinotefran products in some cases. Eugene, Oregon banned from city procurements. Minnesota is considering a ban or restriction right now, which is notable given the heavy ag presence in that state. Congress has gotten involved. There's a couple of bills floating out there. There's the Conyers-Blumenauer bill that's been introduced. I think it's important that it has 73 co-sponsors, including 2 Republicans. So it shows that there's an interest, a broad interest in this. It demonstrates notable support, and as well there's the Congressman Austin, Republican, introduced a bill to speed up the approval of treatments for DPEST. The European Union, as you know, has banned a couple of the neonics on seed treatments, and Canada regulators have said current seed coating practices are not suitable, may do something on that. As well, beekeepers filed a class action suit. And I think that is all I want to mention. So, I mean, I highlight this to say that it's an important issue happening, and there's a discussion happening among NGOs and environmental groups and public health groups. And we, as IPM experts, we miss it if we're not advising our clients and stakeholders. But more importantly, I think that there's an opportunity to have an IPM framework and discussion here. In terms of solutions that I would really like to see, and that is the end.
Okay, great. So is there a question that anyone has for Jen? We got time for one or...
Why just focus on the neonics and not other pesticides?
I do focus, yeah. So that's a good question. So even for pollinator issues, my record goes back through many of them, and even the OPs, all of the NRDC comments mentioned pollinators and all the OPs, so for 14 years. We are focused on the we have an additional focus on the neonics because they're part of the problem, but particularly because of the systemic and persistent nature of them. So we are broadening our language to address concern about persistent pesticides. I think that's a real problem, and the NGOs are doing that, are recognizing that. The fungicide data is very interesting because those were considered to be benign, and I think the interactions with those will be really important. We're also focusing on the expansion of GMO crops, and we filed a petition on that and have done quite a bit of legal work on that as well. But to be clear, we do not think if neonics disappeared that the problem will be solved. We know that it won't be. We know that it's more complicated, and the complexity of the problem, I think, is what begs an IPM discussion around it.
Great. I guess we'll look forward to hearing that then during our panel session. So thank you, Jen. We're now going to move to Tom Moriarty with the EPA, and I will turn it over to Tom, and you can share a little bit about yourself, and we'll listen to your presentation.
Great. Well, thank you, Steve, for inviting EPA to participate. My name is Tom Moriarty. I'm with the Office of Pesticide Programs. I'm in a division called Pesticide Reevaluation Division. And I've been working on pollinator issues, or working with the EPA team on pollinator issues for about 4 or 5 years now. So I think what I want to talk about is sort of this multifactorial approach that Jeff and Jennifer talked about, the multifactorial response to an issue that is multifactorial. And so sort of, we need to sort of think about the issue as multifactorial between factors, and even the response being multifactorial within a factor. So, multiple responses to pest pathogens and disease, multiple responses to poor nutrition, multiple responses to pesticides. So I think that's the tact, or the sort of the line that EPA wants to sort of focus on, has been trying to focus on for a little bit now. So hark back to about a year ago, in August of 2013, EPA issued some label language for the neonicotinoid compounds. In that label language, we were going after the acute nature of the neonics and the foliar application. So acutely toxic, foliar applied during bloom is what we were focused on in that effort. And when we drafted that label language, we identified what we wanted to do is sort of reduce the exposure, but perhaps allow still maintain some flexibility for the grower to use these tools, which are arguably pretty important. And as Jen pointed out, EPA thinks that they do represent a reduced risk for a number of other taxa. But there are issues to be sort of recognized with the neonics. So when we did that effort in the summer of 2013 with the neonics, we identified a number of exceptions to say, you may not apply this during bloom unless the number of exceptions are, one of the exceptions are met, including time of day, the temperature, whether it was done by a state plan, according to a state plan, a public health issue. And then another one that we put in there was related directly to whether or not the applications be made in accordance with under an imminent financial threat or in accordance with an IPM program. So when that information, those labels went out, those changes went out and began to sort of roll in through the registrants of the neonic products, we were getting comments. Well, of course, we didn't have a public comment period, but we certainly got comments anyways. And some of those comments were sort of underscored the bipolar nature of this whole thing, and that is that some people were saying that we were too restrictive by putting an exception of time and temperature inapplicable to certain parts of the country. You're not going to get below 55 degrees in certain areas, or you're not going to be able to apply after a certain time of day in other parts. And then other comments were such that allowing using imminent threat of economic loss or IPM was an exception that you could drive a truck through. So we were getting both sides of that. But at the heart of it, what we were trying to do, what EPA was trying to do, was to raise the bar, to raise the standard of mitigation and protection, but allow flexibility. So enter in about this time, you got states like Florida, North Dakota, Mississippi, and others who began to sort of take this on at their level. And so these are certain states that said, you know what, we need to pull together the stakeholders at our level, including Farm Bureau, commodity, beekeepers, state lead agencies, and others, and figure out what's missing. And what was missing and what drove some of these actions at that level was the communication, was a framework and experiences and support to get the parties at the table talking about what you need to sort of to get along, because there is a silent majority of individuals out there, beekeepers, who are still working in and around commercial agriculture and raising colonies and maintaining their livelihood. So we were seeing and hearing from states that I mentioned who were finding sort of success, or at least a positive vibes by bringing these different stakeholders together and talking about sort of work together and talk about what their respective needs were. So then, as Jen mentioned, and we all know, in June you've got the presidential memo comes out, and in that memo, the president directed EPA to engage the states just on this issue, the states and the tribes, with respect to working with them of what they can bring to the table in terms of local responses, local needs, and the people that they're responsive to. So in August of 14, so about a year after we did the neonic labeling, EPA sent out a letter to the state lead agencies saying that they need to, and we need to engage them, and we need their help to engage the individuals that they're, in their communities on the issue. And again, the heart of it was the idea that, that they are the ones who understand the needs and the resources at their level, and, have the motivation and the relationships to create a response that apparently wasn't working at the federal level. By creating defining the rigid exceptions and practices on a federal level didn't seem to fly from what we got in the comments back from the neonic experience. So what we're thinking about now at this point is to create guidance, trying to get the support of the state lead agencies to pick up the issue or the idea, the concept of using the state-driven the mechanisms and the relationship at the state level to build the framework where collaboration and communication can happen. Now, I think getting back to the idea of the multifactorial within a factor, I think many of us know that there's IPM and BMP ideas out there that are safe for bees. Apply at night. Apply using different application methods, perhaps around colonies, giving the beekeeper time to move his colonies, these sorts of things. But what is needed inside that framework of communication, what is needed is more options, more information, more research, driven information is driven by research about how you can have productive agriculture and protect pollinators. But that's all got to be within the framework of communication, which maybe is the state could be a central player in that. And I also think we think that the IPM centers are a natural hub for that sort of communication as well. So in terms of the framework for communication, there needs to be, to fill out that framework, there needs to be the information, data-driven information. Sources for that information could be private funding that could occur, public-private partnerships like the Corn Dust Research Consortium is an example of that. NIFA and ARS, OPMP, all doing, sort of contributing to the funding stream to create the information that could feed that dialogue between, the beekeeper and the grower, the pesticide user, and how to protect bees. So I think, between EPA, USDA, and some of the state lead agencies, there's a shared interest in, sort of building filling the quiver, with options to protect bees, but still maintain flexibility to protect the crops. So, as we will move forward, EPA is going to when we move forward, how we move forward with pushing and promoting this idea of flexibility at the state levels, EPA will obviously look for public comment on that, because this is an approach that we need a lot of engagement from crop advisors, cooperative extension, beekeepers, growers, and so on and so forth. So it is going to be a broad approach with relying on the input from many experts in the field at the field level. So maybe is this the second slide? No. How about the next slide? I think I've already sort of moved through this a little bit. Want to say that while this is going, and while we're considering applying the same concepts and scientific principles that we apply to the neonics to a broader suite of chemistries, we're continuing to do the chemical-specific assessments. I think a lot of people are familiar that we've recently adopted a framework for pesticide risk assessment. It includes a broader number of tests. It goes after some of the things that Jennifer mentioned, and that is different routes of exposure. It is looking at the different types of effects, not just acute, but subchronic, sublethal effects, chronic exposure, so it's looking at the different routes of exposure, whether it's dietary, whether it's contact. So we'll be continuing to work on the chemical specific analysis, on a chemical by chemical basis. But I think one of the things that sort of is front and center for EPA at this point is acute effects, foliar applications during bloom. I want to also mention in terms of that framework something that Jennifer mentioned, and that is the idea of different species of bees. I think we're in agreement, and I think they're probably we're sort of at the lower part of the curve right now in terms of pesticide risk assessment and knowledge of how to use other bees in that risk assessment framework. We're continuing to explore it, working with bombus and other species, but the curve on working with bees, how to interpret that in a regulatory framework, how to apply that in a risk management scenario, I think we're still low on the curve. We're a little higher up on the curve with Apis mellifera, but so the science is continuing to develop, and we EPA needs to be on the curve and following that science and promoting it as best we can. So just the last word or two about other actions that we're sort of engaged in. Bee kill incidents. This is an important line of evidence in our understanding of how pesticides are used and their effects in the field. So we're looking for ways to improve how and Jen had pointed out the fact that that this is important. The ability for people to communicate to us what's going on, and for the states to be able to investigate those incidents and find out what's the cause of the incident. Is it a bee kill incident? Is it a pathogen in the hive? Is it poor nutrition, or is it a pesticide that's causing that problem? Jennifer mentioned seed treatment. We've been working with the American Seed Trade Association. It's a primary issue for us, and right now we're looking at a number of management options to sort of trying to get our heads around that and our hands around that and manage that risk at this point. Horticultural, the residential ornamental uses, another avenue that we're taking, and we're looking at working with the horticulture industry. IR4 is doing work on that, so we understand that that's a route of exposure, and quite frankly, you're not going to find a lot of managed bees, in our at the garden level, So what is that geared towards? That's geared more towards the native pollinators. So we understand that. We've got the RT25 database that we set out there. I think that's an important piece of information, or could be an important piece of information. We're trying to accelerate varroicides. So now moving from just pesticides and the multiple approaches that we're taking on the pesticides to other factors. The varroicides is one way we can help by accelerating the registration process for getting the varroicides onto market, helping USDA, who is putting on the summits for the other factors, and also responding to the presidential memo. So again, just in closing, multifactorial approach is what IPM is about. Multifactorial issue is what's hitting pollinator health, and even within a factor and between factors, I think it has to be a complex and multi-pronged game plan for everybody, for things to sort of start to turn the corner if we're going to. So that's
Thanks, Tom. Does anyone have a question for Tom they want to ask off the top? Yeah.
Just real quick, the letter that went in August, was that to the Department of Agriculture or to Natural Resources?
It was the Department of Ag, yeah, and the American Association of Pest Control officials.
So at this time, we're going to, I guess, move into more of our panel panel discussion. So we're anticipating 4 people. We've got 3. That's okay. Jeff did a good job of covering Mary for us, so thanks for that. But now I think we're going to just open it up to, questions, something you've heard, something you've been thinking about related to this issue. I know Jen's got an idea of a framework for how IPM can address the pollinator health issue. I think if we find, or if there's a question online maybe that comes up, we can address that too. But I guess I'll just open it up for anyone to jump in and start the discussion.
So, you started off talking about the multifactorial problem, and then EPA, being in the business you're in, of course, you're naturally going to focus on the pesticides, and you came back to the factorial at the end. And Jeff was talking about a broader range of issues. When you have that conversation, is there somebody focusing on the conservation land piece and the habitat piece to the degree that EPA is focusing on the pesticide piece? And you do that because that's what your turf is. But is USDA focusing on the habitat piece to the same extent that EPA is focusing on the pesticide piece?
I think the short answer is that they are. I mean, maybe not in the past, because I think some of our land use policies were kind of counterproductive for pollinators. But recently, NRCS, I think, is taking the lead, National Research Conservation Service, and Farm FSA, thank you. We have 2. We're actually now supposed to all just be USDA. We can't be sub-agencies. So USDA is responding, yes. I'm Agricultural Research Service. I think we're doing a lot on bee health, including we have one lab dedicated to other pollinators, other beyond honeybees. So we're trying to do the research on the pollinators themselves. FSA, NRCS, and other groups within USDA are looking at land management issues and going after it pretty aggressively, I think. EPA, EPA's been at the table for a long time now. There's been a lot of good dialogue. So I think different groups, but it also leaves out the private sector, which I think has really stepped up in a lot of cases. If any of you were we had a 4-H summit, and then we had NAPSI, the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign. And there was a fellow there from Pacific Gas and Electric, I'll say, I think it's PG&E. And he was talking about planting wildlife-friendly, mostly pollinator-friendly things on the right-of-ways in power lines. And there's a huge amount of land out there in pipelines and power lines. So there's a lot of effort going on. Some of it's driven by the government, but some of it's driven by private partnerships out there. So I think there is a lot of stuff.
And states are doing that a lot, actually. Maryland does that if you drive down the highway. There's actually, DOT is interested because there's safety issues. Apparently if there's wildflowers and things, then people have something to look at and they're not as mesmerized on the road, so there's less accidents. It works for me. I'm always like, oh, this is useful.
Just curious, I used to work in field crop pest management. I'm about 9 years removed from it now. It was right in the middle when all the GMO stuff was coming in. And, at that point, prior to, say, putting a BCG in there for corn rootworm or corn borer, whatever you put in there, there was never more than 30% of the corn acreage that was treated with soil insecticide to control that pest. Now we've got all these stack constructs out there. And in order to broaden the spectrum, we put these neonicotinoid seed treatments on every kernel of corn across the United States and also soybeans. So now you're putting this pesticide out there that's ubiquitous, and sometimes it's of value if you have some secondary soil insects, which usually only occur about 5% of the time. But now it's out there ubiquitous, as well as we've minimized our crop rotations, soybean corn rotations, to get away from rootworm. As the value of fuel, the biofuels there and stuff. So it seems like we've gone from having more of an IPM approach to making those decisions to completely back where we were before any of that came through. And then you start getting into the complexity of breeding seed corn, put 3 or 4 genes in it, and just everything has to be treated with the seed treatment, and you're sending out seed before you even know you got a pest. So how do you take all that and go back to some sort of an IPM construct changing how you work with these companies out there.
I don't know, that was my prophylactic comment, that they're treating, in corn and soybeans, we're treating ubiquitously, and I don't know the answer. I don't have a simple answer. Crop rotation would be a good start.
I don't even know if there's ever been a pesticide that's been used as broadly as the neonicotinoids. I mean, even maybe DDT or something. You got to go back a long way before you find something that was used that many arenas.
So now I'm going to be the farmer, and I've got a machine tied up for corn harvest and soybean harvest, and I can put this stuff on my crop and guarantee a yield. So it's like, why wouldn't I do it?
You can't blame the farmer.
Why wouldn't I do it? Exactly. So
it's just we set up our system such that it's very hard to.
I think the pendulum's swung really far in that direction. I don't know how to bring it
it's
back.
not just the neonics that are on the seeds either. I mean, it's the fungicides and other things, and the interactions with them are only with each other. Are only just now coming out. So yeah, it's more complicated.
Well, I'll give you another good short answer. Should we blame Congress? Does Congress listen? No. I can't speak to money matters. But you know, the Extension Service used to be in almost every county in the nation. And the Extension Service used to be the advisory body for growers. Most of the Extension Service has been done by others. I'll just leave it at that. I mean, the Extension Service is not as vibrant as it was as far as crop advising. And like the IPM Center has a good role in that, but Extension is, when you look at cut, Extension has been cut, statewide in many areas.
I'll just make a comment that as a grower, if I have to take $1 and buy fertilizer or irrigate, turn on the diesel pump and irrigate. If I take $1, I get my most value of $1. So my crop is out there, and I've got a boom, and I've got a bunch of flowers. And I've got a window of time of maybe 10 days to pollinate. That if I buy more hives and get more bees, pollinate those flowers, my yield directly goes up. So the best benefit I have is, it's really the Role-mite and all these other things that we're talking about here today. Pesticides and everything is important, but you got to look at the bottom line for the farmer.
Apple grower. I use the example of almonds. All the inputs into almonds, the water, the fertilizer, the sunlight, all that stuff, you can throw it out the window if you don't have pollinators right there for that 2-week period. Same thing, yeah. I mean, we've taken them for granted for a while. So.
This allows you to ask this question of something. What is it about EPA that causes politicians to hate you guys so much?
You have to look that way. I guess they have the tightest security. If you go in federal buildings, EPA has the tightest security. I'm only kidding. We all have tight security.
Why are we so popular? I think the business that EPA and USDA are in is very critical to our security, the ability to have less out than we have, and pesticides in particular. There are other parts of EPA. There's water, there's Superfund, there's other pesticides in particular, the presumptions that you're focusing in on. They're a part of our society, and they are poisons, and we are in the job of trying to license those poisons and trying to create the parameters for the use of those so that they don't create unreasonable adverse effects on human health and the environment. And that's a difficult thing to do. Science changes, technologies change, and it's a very dynamic process, and that's one of the reasons why Congress said that you will, EPA, reevaluate each pesticide every 15 years to ensure that you are following on the science with regard to risk assessment, exposure, the technology that changes in the field, and the like. So it's a dynamic field. There's an awful lot riding on, crop production the efficiency of it, the gardens that we all have, the golf courses that we have, the parks, and things like public health are very important. Pesticides are very important to public health and things. So, but they all have a cost, and that's why we do cost-benefit analysis on when we look at.
I was just going to follow up. One thing that's interesting about EPA, Tom mentioned water, air. Most of the programs at EPA have a role in taking pollutants out of the environment. From what I recall, Office of Pesticide Programs is the only part of EPA that there's no way to regulate putting toxins into the environment. And I think that's one of the differences why you get beat up on a little bit, because you're regulating adding a toxin. If I could follow up with a quick comment or question, and it leads to what I said before. At agency, we're doing this big survey of pests and diseases, and within that, for a year or two, we actually did some sampling of pollen in the hive to look at the levels of pesticides. And part of the reason I answered the question is when you look at, we've got this pie chart. 3% of what we're finding is in the equilibrium, and these not just in the neonicotinoids. Tiny little sliver of the pie. Obviously, most of it is the varroa side that we're consciously putting in. But the big piece of the pie next to varroa is the fungicide. And because it's not an insecticide, I think EPA is not giving it enough attention. I think it was last year, the year before, in the almonds. There was a big bee die-off, and the rumor mill was they were spraying the fungicide while the bees were out there, and that kept, so I appreciate there's a lot of attention in the equipment. Every time I'm on a grant review panel, and I think that we need to think about these organic phosphates and these fungicides in particular.
And whatever connections there are that might be between them, which we might be able to figure out in the lab more. Yeah, there might be lab experiments.
And that's not to say we don't need to pay attention to them, but I feel like that's getting so much focus, and let's not forget some of these other things that are.
Can I add a comment to that? Just in almonds, because 1.7 million colonies of the 2.5 million honeybee colonies that we have in the U.S. go into almonds every year. So, again, what happens in the Midwest affects almonds. What happens in almonds affects the rest of the year. But the spray time for fungicides, the grower, if they're going to have some kind of thing affect the bloom, then the only time they can spray is during blooming, and it's a fungicide. But simply converting to spraying at night probably can reduce the exposure quite a bit if it dries on. So they're looking at alternatives like that, just like everything else. You get locked into a certain thing, we spray in the early morning when the winds are down, we'll reverse it. Pay overtime, bring you guys in at night. I mean, nobody wants to do it. With aerial application, there's all kinds of problems with night application. Everything in almonds is ground application, and so they can do it at night. So there's some things like that we can do.
And Jeff's absolutely right. I mean, there are examples out there, and almonds is a great one. And, in a short while, USDA, I think, is going to release a report entitled Securing Pollinator Health and Crop Protection. And it was a grant that was given to a Pollinator partnership, put it together. I think it's on their website. But it's the idea that in that report, Pollinator Partnership went out and looked at four crops: almonds, corn, I think melon, and apple, and looked at what the knowledge level was about, IPM, pollinator protection, and cultural practices. And by far and away, almonds was ahead of the game because it's such a critical one. But that is to say that they had techniques. Some areas, some growers in California of almonds have specific techniques of maintenance techniques of what they clean their fields, what they do after the bloom, and so how they manage things. All leads to how they need other inputs and when they use certain inputs. And bees are an input for agriculture. So we can look at them that way, and balancing those inputs. And maybe perhaps in some cases bees are more important than the others. But that's not for here. But just the idea that almonds is an excellent example of where applied research can yield practices that change the way things are happening right now into you can see where it could go.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have two follow-up questions. One has to do with Bill about intent. I don't know if you've been able to look at economics of pollination and then putting together cost-effective way and best practices for
address a little bit about the, I know of a number of efforts that some are based on best management practices for the beekeeper, and others are based on best management practices by crop. You know, like if you're going to grow apples, here's some things you could do that are more pollinator friendly. There are some efforts out there. I don't know if they've all come to fruition, but there's been a recognition that we've been lacking a set of guidelines that even if we had an extension service that could go out and deliver that. So this is the message. This is a good message we need to deliver. Global warming. Global warming.
Address that. I'm sorry. It's going to be hard for me to say anything. I know it's an issue. It's something that our office and the agency as a whole has been looking at. I mean, it's a priority for our agency. And I'm not as versed in that as I think many other people are at our agency, but it does touch a lot of what we do. And I think we in the field of pollinator protection and sort of it is clearly an elephant in the room of changing phenologies and different pest pressures. And I think we're all familiar with sort of the growth, sort of a gross understanding of the sort of ripple effect that this is having on agriculture and how we respond. Not just EPA, but the IPM centers and growers and advisors and the technology for dealing with pests and changes in the at that scale that you're referring to. So not a great answer, but I can follow up or give you a contact perhaps.
And that's I guess we've got about half an hour or so left, and I want to focus us again on IPM's role in pollinator health. And so these have been good questions, but my question is where IPM is being practiced, is there a difference in pollinator health in those situations? And that also leads to another question about us defining IPM and what that means, because if you don't define it, you can't apply it and really make it work in a pollinator health type situation, even beyond that. But I guess back to the question of when we're practicing IPM, do we see improvements in pollinator health?
I'll say it's hard for me to say. I don't know if there's been a lot of I don't know if there's been much sort of much of a hard look at where comparing where IPM has and hasn't occurred and the colony health there versus the other. I think for EPA, we would bet that if you've got growers doing scouting, mixing approaches to controlling pests and protecting the pollination as an input, you can only bet, and that's what we're betting on, that is going to lead to the solution or lead to a scenario that we can really support, and that is flexibility and mitigating the risk and trying to protect the pollinators.
I'm familiar with the studies from Penn State and apple orchards, but it was totally organic, I think, apple orchard versus conventional. There's some comparison there, and it mostly dealt with exposure. There's a thing that jumps back to actually some of what all of us have said. We've used honeybees as the model for risk assessment with pesticides. Some of the smaller community nesting bumblebees and solitary bees are more sensitive. So I think in this Penn State study, they showed that in the organic orchards there was more abundance of some of the pollinators. But honeybee colonies are very robust and they don't respond very quickly to perturbation like pesticide exposure. So they were using honeybees in these apple orchards and they weren't seeing much difference. I think where they were seeing the difference was in the native pollinators. The other thing is recently in the last 2 years, there's been some funds focused on, and you had it on your slide, Tom, cotton and looking at cotton systems and where they're using more integrated approach to cotton management and pesticide exposure there. So I think there is some of those studies coming out. We put, I can't remember how much money into that.
In the Southern Row Crop.
In the Southern Row
Yeah,
Crop.
that's an ARS project.
Cotton and some other crops.
Following up on Steve's question, I mean, if IPM is a framework or a possible solution, but this is a multifactorial issue with all this
data. I mean, I don't know the total number of studies that we're talking about internationally and nationally. Has anybody thought of, a science-based approach where you do some meta-analysis and just sit back? I mean, you could go on forever trying to do all these little simple studies. I mean, you need somebody, needs to get to step forward and say, whether it's the issue that you're talking about or any other one, it could be the minor little piece of the pie, but it could be the great factor that's causing it, or a combination of factors. Does anybody propose that kind of approach?
Maybe like
to do a meta-analysis, to take all the data and do the kind of analysis that some
pesticide data?
Everything. All the data on pollinators and honeybees. You can't, your mind, there's supercomputers that do this kind of analysis. I'm not a statistician to know how to set them up, but the amount of data and studies become overwhelming, and you have to have some way to sort it out.
I'm going to say, I don't, there have been, I know that we've seen some meta-analyses. A couple of years ago, I think, in Europe, I think there was major, sort of efforts like that. I don't know if there's been one in the last year.
There's been some that are looked at two factors at a time, but not, I'm not aware of two factors.
Yeah, I haven't either. I was referring mainly to the one on pesticides that I know about. But I want to sort of, and I'm sorry, but what I think is, what can happen is, there are efforts within, if you go back to the stovepipe and you look at just cherry production or apple production, there is a manual amount of information there. There are pest management, guidelines, and there are people, there are extension agencies in the Northwest and North Central that know about the crop and the crop production system. Those people, I think, need to sit down and say, what's the data in front of us? What do we know? What are the knowledge gaps? And how do you begin to sort of build it? Because there are, if you look at just spray drift, there's spray drift reduction technology. That's just looking at, again, it's a stovepipe approach, just looking at the technology of reducing spray drift. But then you need, Almond has looked at itself and figured how can we better manage pollinators as an input and still, do this. But it has to happen, maybe it can happen, geographically, regionally, by crop, by technology, and then maybe at a certain point there will be, a sort of a higher level, a meta sort of, management, scaling it, would be to say to the cherry growers, to the cotton growers, or to the, what do you know, what do you need to know, what questions are out there, what questions can be asked, and can be answered by applied research to sort of bring these things together. So, I'm sorry.
It seems like there's a lot of different layers to this question here, but I think, one of them is just preventing bees being exposed to pesticides in any given crop that you're trying. And I mean, a lot of those principles have been in place for, many of the things you mentioned in terms of spraying at night or not spraying during the pollination period or using products that are less, toxic to bees, those sorts of things. So, but the colony collapse piece of this is a lot more complicated than just whether they're exposed to pesticide in terms of reducing it. You don't know how much of it's due to the fact you're shipping them around the country 5 times and stress them and you throw a little pesticide and a little bromide and a little virus in there and all these other things, and next thing you know, you've just overwhelmed them, and so it's like looking at, if your goal is to keep the bee colonies alive, then that may be a different thing beyond just, what you can do in a crop. If a crop takes one element away, it minimizes it.
I mentioned this forage summit that we just had, and one of the issues there, because the beekeepers claim that there's less and less forage available for them. They're just more and more cropland, less forage, natural forage, more natural forage. So one of their big pushes was access to public and or private land, and they thought that would be a big help. And then there was some push within the federal government to allow that Bureau of Land Management, things like that, open up some more land. But then you get into issues of honeybees are an invasive species, and they're not the best neighbors for some situations. They won't work in national parks and stuff. So I agree with you. I have to put on my Mary hat. Hi, I'm Mary. Mary has to be here for a little bit, right? Sure. So, back to your question. No, I won't impersonate her, but the CAP funded info grant, the 5-year grant, we're about 3.5 years into that, and that is gathering a lot of information on all types of things, the varroa mite levels, the nosema levels, all these bacterial and fungal infections. We're getting data from APHIS National Survey. Thank you, Rob. We're getting information from all these things in the U.S. And after 3 years of data collection, we're finally in a position where, at least for honeybees, because we get to tease apart some of those primary factors. And I'm going to lump them into three things. And this, I'm going to tie in. I'm going to avoid using the word CCD, but I have to say it. We used to lose about 10% of the colonies, honeybee colonies nationally, before varroa. When we got varroa, it went up to about 20%. Now we're at 30%. So 30%, so we've added, 10% was normal for a beekeeper. With varroa, 20% is sort of normal. Now we're at 30%, and that's a combination of a lot of different factors. So, and maybe CCD is part of that.
Can I comment on the best practices? The spraying at night and not during bloom and all the stuff that's on the label. That, and actually it's your prophylactic comment, is it doesn't work when you have a systemic persistent chemical.
And that's why you don't have an IPM option when you're putting on a seed treatment.
Which is a little bit goes to your why focus on the neonics, and the answer is it's not only the neonics, and we have a huge monarch and preserve role areas, buffer zones that have natural, all that kind of stuff. But this is the issue is I think it takes it out of IPM options because you have something systemic and long lasting. And I really think that there's a space to have the conversation that we're having now where we really bring experts together. I think that's not quite happening. But with an IPM framework, because I think that IPM people, I see them, you guys, as sort of the bold and the brave, like the Star Trek mission of agriculture, because you're early adapters of new technology. You're not afraid to try new things. You're willing to be flexible and see what can be used in the moment. And you know the mission. The mission is to get the crop to market safely. So you're not gonna sacrifice the OA team on the planet. You're gonna get them to market. And I think that IPM hasn't taken yet a broad role in helping to shape the solutions. And I think the solutions, because of how complex the problem is, are going to have to be region-specific and crop-specific and pest-specific and season-specific and flexible every new season and new crop and new region. It's not going to be a spray at night, don't spray on blues, put it on the label and you're done kind of thing. And I think there's a role here, but I don't know, I would like to see that conversation happen where it gets put down on paper and people can share.
One of the things that happened when the GMOs were coming out, the monarch butterfly controversy came to light, was there was a group that came together, some of the major seed companies as well as environmental groups, that formed a kind of a coalition task force to come together and bring the scientists to one place, sit down and say, what kinds of research do we need to do to get to the bottom of this issue of whether or not adoption of PT corn is going to lead to, extinction of monarch butterfly or anything else like that. And they came together and they had a conversation and laid out specific issues that needed to be addressed. And then they put up a few $100,000. It wasn't a lot of money. Everybody went away and they did the research and they came back with a short period of time with their best estimates of what was going to happen to monarch butterfly because of the introduction of PT corn. And I was part of that group. And so that was a very effective way to bring people around the table to talk about these things and from all sides of it.
Really
think out the issue and think what needs to happen, and then you go away and have some more systematic way of addressing the questions that need answering and look for what those tactics and approaches might be to help minimize or mitigate some of these things.
Go ahead. That's what Jennifer just said. And, what you described is IPM. And, season situation. But it's hard enough to incentivize IPM to the grower who's got their own closed loop incentives to do it. It's a fair crop. But just as an observation, in this situation, their rationale for doing it is really for an external good. So you've got another layer of selection there.
But there's the bees. As a motivator. To right? Or no, is that not enough?
Well, I mean, even an apple grower is really focused on growing apples. Yes, they value the bees, but it's an externality to them. So I don't have an answer. I'm just saying it's another thing to consider.
That's a good point, because there's also the idea that companies, industry is interested in more than just the product now. They're interested in how it's produced. Whether it's a sustainable effort, and how are growers going about doing that, and is that an avenue for incentivizing these practices? If you practice conservation, and if you don't practice conservation, you're doing probably a lot more work, and I'm just generalizing that, but your payoff is maybe not realized when you're not doing, as opposed to not doing conservation practice. So how can we kind of get people to see beyond just that provisional ecosystem service and get to see the aesthetics, the cycling, the other services that these systems are really providing, and where do we kind of include that in this framework?
Or what about, to answer that question, I think this is an answer, but so make it a market advantage for those crops the way we have like your dolphin safe tuna thing or something. And so we know that Whole Foods, for example, has adopted practices that forces producers, if they want to sell to Whole Foods, to meet. And pollinators are one of those issues. But if you had an IPM practices, IPM to me represents the practical transition to, like I say, getting a crop to market safely while addressing all these issues and being flexible and giving the farmer flexibility. Then groups like mine could create the market incentives and work with those groups.
I had on my slide, I don't remember the green logo, bee-friendly farming.
So the only downside of that is if you are a farmer buying seed corn or soybeans, you have no alternative.
We need to
because
create
the best genetics are in the GMO stuff, and they all have seed treatment when you buy. You can't. You got to specifically ask for it, then it's a special.
I was going to say the best steps can be made in specialty crops and things like that. If you started going after changing that ship of corn and soybeans right away, you're going to be beating your head against the wall. But I think in smaller crops and fruit and vegetable production, there's a lot to be gained. I was just saying that bee-friendly farming or something that identifies to the grower that, okay, my apples were grown, using these practices, and maybe they can, it's kind of like the organic.
Unfortunately, that gets us back to defining IPM.
Okay.
Because if there's no agreed upon definition of IPM, anyone can put an IPM produced label on their product. Now, organic, you can't do that because it's certified, and you have to meet these different standards. So I think that's one of the dynamics that the IPM community, in a way, struggles with, is to how to really, identify what IPM is. And what you think it is might not be the same as what you think it is.
And see, I agree with you. I think there needs to be clarification around what are the components of IPM. That general principles of building blocks, what are the practices of IPM, things like that. But in terms of, if you go back to pesticides, I think there's a role for EPA to sort of be looking towards IPM, supporting IPM, promoting IPM. Resistance is an issue. We know it is, and it's not just herbicide resistance; it's insecticide resistance. So we have a role. I think industry has a role. I think crop advisors, cooperative extension research has a role in supporting that. But you could also see perhaps in pathogen management. There's got to be the beekeeper organizations need to play a role in IPM to control pathogens in there, and they need to step up. Because I've heard for many years that they can't coordinate. But, this is a classic resistance issue, right? And then there's the issue of nutrition. So, there needs to be, I think different people have a role in promoting it. The one that comes most clear to me and most immediately is obviously pesticides, because that's, right, I know from. So I can see how EPA has a role, how industry has a role, and how the contributing to IPM centers all have a role in crafting the dialogue that it begins to move away from the prophylactic sort of easy off approach to pest management.
And I don't want to see our limitations make us go the other way. I'm very much, that's not what I'm saying. It's how can we move forward and get to a point where maybe we define IPM, it's accepted at a broad scale. But that's the direction I think we're going. And I think you hit on it, and I think it's been said a lot of times, is communication and having this discussion and keeping IPM in the conversation, however it's defined, I think is part of that. Because if you eliminate it completely based on what we can't agree on what it is, we're not doing it justice. We're not doing any good. So I think that's I think where we're at, and maybe where we're going to move forward.
If the consumer recognizes this organic thing from USDA, you have to meet these guidelines. Is there a role? Can IPM have like a couple of levels? Integrated pest management, or do it improved? In other words, you're not going to, if you just say IPM, you're right. There's so much room in there. But maybe, I wonder if, I don't know, I wonder if USDA could say, okay, we're going to recognize that you lose some integrated pest management, or even to the next level, leading towards, different level.
I don't see any reason it couldn't be done on a crop-by-crop basis. If we could do it for organic, we could do it for IPM. And the reason organic has taken off in America is because of consumer demand and recognition of what is organic and what isn't organic. And there are several scenarios in which organic is not necessarily going to be possible, particularly in our region of West Virginia. It's a really large fruit growing region, a lot of apples, peaches, small fruits, etc. You don't have a weird pest pressure, both insect and pathogens. And what's happened is many of our growers who are concerned, and most of it is actually spurred by the honeybees. What they've done is they've shifted. They're asking for help from ARS, for instance, in terms of how can I do this with an IPM approach. And they're self-labeling themselves as IPM. And so at our farmers markets in D.C., for instance, in this region, a lot of the fruit growers are saying, we practice IPM, and they are then trying to educate the consumers at the stand as to why they're different, how that separates them and differentiates them, from a more conventional approach.
One of the things I was going to say is, when we think about this, when we think about IPM, it's sort of within the bounds of the field or the unit that you're doing it versus pollinators move across the landscape. So they go into those fields and they go other places too. And I don't know whether Gale and Dively's still doing it or not, but at one point in time they were looking at these riparian buffers and looking at pollinator plants and working with conservation districts, NRCS and others to make that sort of the mix that you would plant in those areas. The same way with COP land could be the same way, which provides a lot more alternatives for these native pollinators and anglers, but also honeybees to help them look at other places besides within that field.
Just following up on that, and you're already doing it with your one working group, by having these pollinator habitats, you're also bringing in your natural enemies and your biocontrol organisms, which we haven't brought up yet, but just contributing to IPM. So the industry, the center is already sort of, I think, taking a step, I think, through that working group, like providing that.
Right. We have about 5 minutes left, and so I know, Jen, you mentioned this IPM framework, so I don't want to exclude it.
I kind of brought it up. Yeah, I think there's a conversation space here, but I kind of also want to say that I think it's important not to just think about the commercial honeybees and not to just focus on the neonics and not to get caught up in that, because we want whatever solution we come up with, we want the solution to address those things. We want the solution to be a habitat expanding, helping other pollinators, helping the native bees, blah, blah, blah. It wants to be an IPM goal is the solution. So I think it's important to make sure, however we define the problems for the public and for talking points and for the media or whatever, I think we need to always keep in mind this larger solution that we're looking for. And I think IPM is the solution, so I think IPM should be the discussion.
Instead of happy cows, we need happy bee program.
Great. Well, just, some of the things that I heard were, things like diversity and site-specific and systems approach, but also communication. Communicating, whether it's, growers, honeybee operators, whether it's, within this group expertise, I think that's a key part of it. And I think our center and the other regional IPM centers that may be listening in, may be involved, I think that's where we play a role in this, is initially to support that communication. There's some other efforts that I know are going on with studies or things like that. But I think, for us to be able to help facilitate communication, I think is part of our role, but also, house information, resources that people can come to us and either give them that or point them in the right direction, I think is where we're at right now.
The role of the center is communication. One thing that would be very helpful, an IPM specialist going out and doing a talk next week at CPA, gathering information from all over the place. From Almonds, from Beltsville, making her look at it. Yet still, this is not my thing. Okay, I mean, I work with pesticides. Jen and I have some good conversations about it, and he needs to be at the table. But you guys, is there a way? There's agents who have questions who are, we still have county agents in our state, doing these talks. Is there a way to us to have some most important common talking points? I know this is asking for the moon and the stars. Does everybody agree with? Maybe are there like 6 slides? What's his name? Dave, who works with the ornamentals industry. There's a link. He just did this big talk at the ornamentals meeting in North Carolina. They get together from Michigan State. And so he has this big, 95-slide presentation with, so there's a lot of stuff. How do we really, at least for a few key talking points, I'm not saying we're not going to go off on our own feelings, tangents, whatever, but is there something the center can do with that?
We can look into it and depending on who we, can connect with, I think that's definitely a possibility.
Yeah, I would feel like maybe we as a Northeast IPM Center, maybe a similar message we send on some part of that.
Right. And update those as we go forward with.
I don't know. I don't know if we can all come to agree on any of that. You're not surely going to get that together and make it much, but he might be, he'd be interested in these discussions and what that might mean.
Right. Good suggestion. Anyone else have any comments, suggestions, ideas that you want to share before we end? Okay, well, thank you again for our speakers for coming and contributing to this discussion. And thank you to those folks online for joining us as well. So look forward to continuing this as we go forward.
You can stay here or don't forget about it before you leave.